The men's basketball team might be on upset watch starting this weekend, but the women's basketball team is on an entirely different kind of watch as they're eyeing a Final Four this March.
You are Locked On Hoosiers, your daily podcast on the Indiana Hoosiers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Hoosiers, your one and only daily one-stop shop for everything IU athletics. I'm your host, as always, Jacob Rude. Want to thank you guys for making us your first listen every single day. We spent Wednesday's episode talking the men's team, specifically Kent State, the opponent, getting a sense of who they are. Let's flip it up a little bit and talk about the women's team. Get a sense of who they're going to come up against in their bracket. Obviously, a little less worry about an upset as a one seed, but to help us talk about the women's team, their bracket, their region, everything about the women's tournament, we have Sabrina Merchant, writer for The Athletic, covering women's basketball. Friend of the show, was on about this time last year, but maybe most importantly, someone I helped convince early on to get on the IU bandwagon. And we rode that one to the bank with the best season in program history. We'll kind of start on that note. It was the best season in program history. They didn't exactly bathe themselves in glory at the end of the season. They still end up with the number 2 overall seed. Do you think that was the right spot to seed them in this tournament?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me back. I had totally forgotten that this was the beginning of my my dive into Hoosiers, secondary fandom. So thank you for, having me on during the 2022 tournament, and thank you for letting me enjoy vicariously all of the goodness that was this season for the Indiana Hoosiers. I mean, they absolutely deserved the number 2 overall seed. This was a number 1 seed resume with a bullet. All of those wins against top 25 teams, against teams that were quad 1 in the country. The fact that they won the Big Ten regular season, the deepest conference in the country, even while losing the last game of the regular season. I mean, this is just a team that has looked so poised and disciplined and comfortable executing on both ends of the floor all year long. I mean, there was that slight blip after Berger got hurt at the start of the Big Ten season, and they, really comfortably came back from that, especially when Grace came back. So, yeah, I mean, there was a question over who the last 2 number 1s were going to be. I don't think there was any question over who the second number 1 was going to be. It was definitely Indiana. They deserve that spot. And I mean, if there is a team that has a chance to win the tournament other than South Carolina, I think Indiana's probably your best bet.
Yeah, it's still wild to look at all of those betting odds and all the projections. And we talked about it earlier this week with 538 predicting South Carolina with a 64% chance to win the tournament. This is maybe a little bit of semantics just in kind of talking about the Hoosiers. But, I mean, I guess you also would say that they've just been the second best team in the country this year as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they have the resume of the second best team in the country, but they've also just looked the part. I think LSU has the fewest losses of any non-South Carolina team, in the major conferences. But I think we can agree that Indiana's schedule is kind of puts LSU's to shame. I mean, frankly, most Power 5 team schedules put LSU's to shame. So I think just that consistency, the fact that they have, these 2 stars in Berger and Mackenzie Holmes who can dominate the game in such different ways, and all of that surrounding talent, Big Ten Coach of the Year performance from Terry Morin. I do power rankings every week at The Athletic, and Indiana was comfortably in that second slot, I think, since at least the end of January, but maybe earlier than that. So yeah, this is the second best team in the country. Unfortunately, the gap between 1 and 2 is there, but second best.
In any other, I was gonna say, in any other year, they'd have a very legitimate chance at winning the title. It'll be an interesting matchup if they get there. We might talk about that later, but when kind of taking that into account, how good this season has been for them, and like I said, the best in program history, you kind of start thinking about what the expectations are for this team. And when looking at the Greenville 2 region, I almost wanted to say Midwest. It's a very different naming system. We got to work on that NCAA. But when looking at that region, it felt like a pretty favorable draw for the Hoosiers.
Yeah, I would say that this is maybe the weakest region of the draw, which is interesting because you would expect that to go to South Carolina, considering that they're the number one overall seed and deserving of the most comfortable path to the Final Four. But, I mentioned LSU earlier. I think they're the weakest of the number three seeds. I like Jesus. I like Ohio State's chances better than LSU's. Although, considering Olivia Miles' injury, maybe LSU is not the weakest of the three seeds. The three line is really not great across the board. But I'm not super enamored with LSU. And I think Utah, just because of their inexperience in the tournament, the fact that, this is the first time they've hosted since 2001. I think that, Indiana having been there in the Sweet 16 last year and the Elite Eight the year before, like that's definitely something that comes to play when you're playing a team like Utah that kind of just burst onto the national scene this year and is really doing it for the first time. So yeah, I mean, I like some of the double-digit seeds in that bracket, but I don't think that they're going to be a threat to Indiana. I just think that in terms of the twos, probably got the weakest one in Utah. Villanova is a good team, but they haven't really beaten anyone great. And if you can just do some good work against Maddie Siegrist, I think that team is beatable. So yeah, I'm not terribly concerned about the other top four seeds. Obviously, it's March, things happen, but
Yep.
I think it's a good path for them to get to Dallas.
I talked a couple weeks ago. It actually might have been before the conference tournament for the women's team about what kind of success looked like for the rest of the season. And at the time, it felt weird to say that this team probably should be in the Final Four, especially without having seen the bracket or anything. It feels weird just because that's not something the women's team has ever done. Like it would be the first time where it would be uncharted waters. So to say that's the expectation is wild to think about, but having seen how this bracket kind of fell for them, should that be the expectation of this team now?
I wouldn't say that it'd be, I mean, this isn't the word that you use, but I wouldn't say that it's a disappointment if they don't get to the Final Four just because of all that has already been achieved this season. The number 2 ranking, the fact that they're a number 1 seed, and the fact that they won, the Big Ten title outright, not even a shared title, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I think like the betting favorite is definitely Indiana to get to the Final Four in this region. You look at the other ones and there's a lot of love for Iowa and, Seattle 4, a lot of love for UConn and Seattle 3, even teams like Texas, Iowa State, like ones that won their conference tournaments, like tend to inspire a little bit more love. But I don't really see a lot of other picks out of Greenville too. Like it's just Indiana. So I think they're definitely the favorite to get to the Final Four out of this region. They're the team that I'm picking to get to the Final Four out of this region. And I don't think that there is a matchup that really scares me if I'm Indiana.
Yep.
So yeah, I don't want to say that like you come into, your opening matchup in Bloomington saying, all right, 4 more wins, let's do this. But like that's what should happen, I think.
Yeah. That's kind of where I've been as well, is that it just feels weird to treat it as that, is like, well, get to the Final Four now. This is the path's laid out. The good news is that the Hoosiers haven't really had any of those let off performances at all throughout the year. And even if Final Four is not the expectation, but kind of the belief of what this team should accomplish, they haven't overlooked anybody this year. Maybe save for the second half against Ohio State, though I don't know how much that was overlooking and how much that was Ohio State just kind of taking advantage of a situation. But let's take a little bit of a deeper look at this Greenville 2 region and some of the teams to watch, the players to watch, things like that. We'll do all that here in just a minute. First, let's talk about our sponsor today, FanDuel. It's March. There's no better time to be betting than during the NCAA tournament. There's no better time to join FanDuel than right now because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. It's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. We're all going to miss at some point betting during March. So you get bonus bets back when you do. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. If you want to bet on the Hoosiers to win the title, it's wild odds. It's South Carolina is minus odds, minus 185, but then the Hoosiers, Stanford, and Iowa are all plus 850 odds to win the title. So they're the second favorite. It's big odds, but it's if you believe there's money to be made there, So don't miss out on your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to fanduel.com/locked on. That's fanduel.com/locked on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Big thanks to all you guys for making us your first listen every single day. Make sure you grab your bracket and go listen to the Locked On College Basketball Bracket Breakdown. It's national analysis and the insights from our local experts. The Locked On College Basketball Bracket Breakdown has everything you need to know and to make the most informed decisions on your bracket. Find the episode over at Locked On College Basketball, wherever you listen to podcasts, or on YouTube. Let's take a look at this Greenville 2 region. We've talked a little bit about it. I'm willing to overlook Tennessee Tech and Monmouth for the sake of this discussion. Knock on wood, we don't become the second 1 seed to lose to a 16 seed. So eyes on that Oklahoma State-Miami matchup. The storyline potentially would be the Gerzon sisters playing one another if Oklahoma State wins, but is there anything either of these teams do that could potentially bother Indiana or make them any kind of threat for an upset?
I will admit in doing my research for this podcast that I completely ignored the 16s, so I'm glad that you've also chosen to do so. Apologies to NC Tech and Monmouth, but yeah, Oklahoma State and Miami. Oklahoma State's a pretty decent offensive team. I wouldn't say they're a great one, but they shoot the ball really well from every area of the floor, and just the kind of team that likes to put up high scores and run and gun with you a little bit. But I mean, it hasn't worked out that well. They do have a couple of wins against Iowa State and Texas, which honestly, the win against Texas really caught my eye because Texas has done a good job of controlling the tempo against teams that like to, push the pace and score pretty efficiently. So I think that's a more distressing matchup if you're Indiana, just because of their ability to put up points even against teams that are nominally like really stout defensively. Miami is just, they're a good defense. Again, like good relatively speaking. They had some nice ACC wins. The one against Virginia Tech, I think, is the one that really, really stands out. But that was back in early January when the Hokies were still like considering playing Ashley Owusu. So it's a little different of a team than the one that currently exists. But yeah, they had a lot of opportunities to win big games in the ACC. They pulled off wins against Virginia Tech, against North Carolina, against Florida State. So there's an opportunity there. I just don't think that they really have the offensive firepower to compete with Oklahoma State or, further down the line against Indiana. So I think the more challenging matchup would be against Oklahoma State just because of their specific offensive set. Like it could really get high scoring before you know it.
You mentioned there were a couple of maybe double-digit seeds or other teams of note to watch in the Midwest. Or I wrote the Midwest again in Greenville. Who are some of those teams that kind of jump out to you in this bracket?
Yeah, well, a couple of them in particular. Actually, three of them, which is kind of like cheating. But Princeton, they haven't lost since January. They played Indiana last year. We remember that game. It was a 1-point win for the Hoosiers in the tournament last year. Just a really, really disciplined team that keeps the pace slow, executes super well in the half court, and doesn't make mistakes. And so you can't really run up like off turnovers or anything. It's just a team that you have to execute well against. I think Indiana's better than they were last year, and I'm not sure I can say the same about Princeton because Abby Myers is obviously in Maryland now instead of still with Tigers. But that's just still a really, really good basketball team and one that you have to bring your A game against. So I like Princeton quite a bit. Florida Gulf Coast is just kind of one of the more fun teams for me to watch every year because they're like the preeminent adopters of the 5-out system in women's college basketball. And I love the way they play. And, that volume of threes, when you put them up, it's hard to compete with. I mean, we saw Elizabeth Kitley put up 42 points in the NCAA tournament first round last year, and they still lost to Gulf Coast. And Elizabeth Kitley's a freaking menace. So that's an impressive addition to their resume. And I would be, circling that Washington State FGCU game in the first round. I think that's going to be a really fun one. And then UNLV, they have, I think they've won the last 22 games. They swept through the Mountain West Conference. They've got a head coach who is, a former Stanford alum, Tara Vanderveer protege, and Lindy LaRoque. I really like watching them play. They're just not at all like, Princeton or Gulf Coast. They kind of play a little bit more conventionally, but they've got this just bruising center in Desiree Young who, when she gets buckets, she gets buckets. And I think that's going to be a tough one for Michigan. So yeah, 10, 11, and 12, I think all of those teams could win in the first round. Not projecting them to do much beyond that, but I think, teams to keep an eye on for sure.
Does Florida Gulf Coast mimic the Dunk City madness that their men's team did a couple years ago?
Well, they don't dunk, unfortunately. They're the and threes part of the dunks and threes. They just take
Gotcha.
so many threes. And like that's the way you engender chaos if you're the
Yeah.
underdog, right? So it's just a hard system to prepare for on short notice. And I think, they're going to give the Cougars problems if they end up going beyond that. That's going to be a tough one for Villanova / Cleveland State. But yeah, I mean, Carl Semesko is one of the very best coaches in the country. Plug here, we did this poll of coaches around the country for The Athletic. That's answers are running all this week. And one of the things that someone said about Carl Semesko is that, they just win 25, 30 games with players you've never heard of. Like, that's what he does every year. There's a reason he's been attempted to poach by many other big programs around the country. Like USC came calling for him, much like their men's program did with Andy Enfield after the Dunk City, escapades in 2013. So just a really solidly run team, and they definitely take advantage of the analytics. So you got to just pay attention.
First in 3-pointers attempted per game, first in 3-pointers made per game, ninth in 3-point percentage. So, yeah, holy moly, that'll be a fun team to watch this weekend and maybe this month as a whole. There's obviously, when we're talking about players to watch, one very notable one, but on top of Maddie Siegrist, who I'm sure that you're going to talk about, I guess, who are some of the other players to watch as well in this bracket?
Well, the obvious answer would be Angel Reese, another first-team All-American who plays for LSU. Someone to keep an eye on. But yeah, we talked about Princeton. I think the team that they're about to play, NC State, I'm almost keeping an eye on just who's on their bench because Diamond Johnson, I believe, is their best player this year, and she was unable to go for the end of the ACC season and the ACC tournament. Their head coach said that she's still experiencing pain, so if she's not able to play, that's just a real sucky outcome because NC State was a great story in last year's tournament. And, you'd love to see those players able to, cap off that awesome performance that they put up against UConn. Same region as Indiana last year, now that I'm thinking about it. So, yeah, Diamond Johnson's a player I have an eye on. Just one of those guards that you need to just get your team going during the tournament. I mentioned for UNLV, Desiree Young, really enjoy watching her play. For Utah, Alyssa Peely gets most of the adoration because she just scores so efficiently for Utah. But Gianna Neepkins is, their guard who I really think is kind of like the motor of that team for the Utes, and excited to see what she does. Her first real opportunity on the national stage because nobody gets the Pac-12 network. So those are a few that I have my eye on. But yeah, you mentioned one of the biggest ones is Maddie Siegrist, who has yet to score below 20 points in any game this season, which is kind of a cool stat. I don't think a lot of NBA players accomplish that, and they play even more minutes than Maddie Siegrist does. She just is so good at scoring from every area of the court, and despite the fact that she is the alpha and omega of Villanova's offense and defenses are always keyed in to stop her, she just makes it work every single time. And the only person I've seen even credibly guard her this year is Aaliyah Edwards, and what do you know? She still put up at least 20 points every time they played UConn. So that's definitely a name to keep an eye on.
The game logs for Maddie Siegrist are wild because she puts up some gaudy numbers against good teams. 50 points against Seton Hall, 41-16 at Temple, 39-11, 37-11, 36-13. She's first team All-American, absolutely incredible. How does she compare, just as kind of a reference point, to someone like Caitlin Clark, who IU fans might be a little bit more familiar with?
So Maddie Siegrist can shoot the three, and she does. I think her percentages are pretty good from out there too. It's just not the major part of her shot diet. She's more of a, inside the perimeter getting her work done because she is a power forward. So I think she's just a little bit less flashy than the way Caitlin Clark gets about her business because her shots are within, double digit feet. Like 12 to 18 feet of the basket instead of where Caitlin is popping off from. But she has such a hard release to guard because she keeps her elbow so high above her head that even though she's only 6'1", it's just very, very hard to contest her jumper, which makes it, all the more likely to go in. And just a really, durable player. Like, she plays a lot of minutes. She's equally effective from every area of the court. She just, gets her work done wherever you give her the ball, right? And I think that's what kind of makes her different, is that Caitlin Clark definitely has these areas where she specializes. Maddie Siegrist just like, give her the ball and she's gonna score. Like, she's not a playmaker I wouldn't call her that at all. Like, that's definitely a role that Clark occupies within the Iowa offense, but she's just a scorer. She's just a really, really good scorer, and she led the nation in scoring this year.
Yeah, 28.9 points per game. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of maybe the biggest threats to the Hoosiers that we've mentioned a little bit in this bracket. We'll do that here in just a moment. We've kind of mentioned both Utah and LSU, maybe a little bit in passing. Let's talk first about LSU, because you mentioned in terms of record, 28-2, it looks really good. And Angel Reese, a name that Hoosier fans are probably familiar with from her time at Maryland, but it's a record, as you kind of said, that they didn't play a whole lot of tough games, and the couple that they did play, they struggled in, especially that South Carolina game. What kind of threat is this LSU team to Indiana?
I've been pretty low on LSU all season, I think even lower than most of the national consensus. I mean, as it stands, they beat one team that was ranked in the top 25 in the final AP poll, and that was Tennessee. Wow. And Tennessee didn't exactly, live in the AP poll for most of the year 2023, right? And that was one win they had. They ended up losing to Tennessee in the semifinals of the SEC tournament, despite having a double-digit lead earlier in the game. So they just seem very untested to me. They had that high-profile game against South Carolina, hyping it up as much as possible. I think it was an ABC showcase. At the very least, it was on ESPN during that Sunday morning. And they just fell flat, like, immediately. South Carolina took it to them. Angel Reese had this double streak, going for the entirety of the regular season to that point. Gets limited to, like, 4 rebounds because they're, just crashed and roll over the glass. Not as efficient as you would need to be against a team that defends as well as South Carolina. And Indiana, does not defend as well as South Carolina. Nobody defends as well as South Carolina. The gap between the top 2 defenses is just, it's stupid, really. But Indiana's a really good defensive team, and they protect the defensive glass well too. So that's the kind of thing where Angel Reese's best quality is kind of like, I don't mean to, like, diminish her game, but, like, she, like, Moses Malone's a lot of shots where, like, her second jump is so good that she's consistently collecting her own offensive rebounds, and, like, doesn't have the best touch around the rim, but she's constantly getting second chances, which really helps out. But I think that, when you have a player like Mackenzie Holmes, who I believe was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, that's exactly the kind of player that you want defending Angel Reese. And I think you can feel comfortable putting her in those one-on-one situations, or even because LSU doesn't have a ton of shooting around Angel, like, you can even sort of clog the lane with, like, Sydney Parrish and, Yarden, whoever, like, just to put more bodies on Angel and just prevent her from getting all of those second chances. Because once you keep LSU off the glass, their first shot offense is not super impressive. So I don't think that they're a terrible matchup for Indiana. Obviously, like, I'm saying a lot of bad things about them. That's not entirely the case. Like, they're, they won a lot of basketball games. It's very impressive. Like, they shoot really well inside the arc. They shoot really well from 3, although they don't take very many threes. It's mostly just a very paint-bound offense. But the fact that, Indiana is so tested, right? 10-3 in those quad 1 games. How many ranked teams that they beat all season, right? Like that first Ohio State win when they were down at halftime and then ended up just using that ridiculous third quarter, or the win against Maryland, the first win against Iowa. Like, they've been in these moments and met the moment, right? LSU has rarely ever been in the moment. And then when they have been, they just didn't come through. So I'm just not entirely convinced that LSU is ready for this particular stage. And then the fact that, like, Kim Mulkey is putting out quotes like, our fans are sometimes ridiculous. Like, they think they're just guaranteed a berth to the Final Four. And it's like, well, hey, you lost 2 games all season. Maybe you could talk about making the Final Four. So I'm not convinced by LSU, clearly, as this entire diatribe has suggested. But I also think that, like, the specific warts of the game, the fact that they're not going to put up a lot of points on you from 3-point range, that they're really interested in attacking you through the paint. And I think Indiana defends the paint pretty well.
And there is a familiarity there with Angel Reese. She played IU 3 times last year. Now, she had a double-double in every game, but the last two games, Mackenzie Holmes was very much not 100% in those. So that just between the team that IU would have and the coaching staff, there is a familiarity there if they get to that point. The number 2 seed in this bracket is Utah, led by Alyssa Peely. You mentioned that another team that kind of has not experienced this level of success in recent years as well. How big of a threat would they be with Peely, another really, really talented player?
So Utah's a little bit more interesting to me just because they're so efficient as a scoring team, whereas LSU gets their scoring done by volume. Utah just shoots the ball really well from the paint and from three-point range. Like Peely is, I mean, hard to believe, like more of an efficient scorer than Angel Reese, and it's very, very hard to stop her in the lane. I think only Cameron Brink has like even come close to approximating the level of defense you need to defend Alyssa Peely in the Pac-12, and like Cameron Brink is a pretty special player. So I think that's a more difficult challenge in terms of defending Peely one-on-one. It's been really hard for most teams to do all year. So just the offensive firepower that they have, I think, stands out to me a little bit more than LSU, especially because they can, bring it on from three-point range. Like they do have shooters in terms of, Neepkins, although they lost one of the best shooters to Gonzaga this year, but that's a whole nother story. I just think that their variety of offense, the fact that they can beat you from the perimeter and the lane, makes them a little bit more challenging to stop. But, they had a rough go in the Pac-12 tournament too. They lost to Washington State, who ended up winning the Pac-12 tournament as it stands. But yeah, I think I'm really excited to see the Utes because, most of the country hasn't really watched them, right? They weren't on national TV at all this year. Even the Pac-12 games that made it onto national television, like that was Arizona, Oregon, UCLA, Stanford. That did not include Utah because going into the season, who would have thought to include Utah on those national broadcasts? And like I mentioned earlier, like nobody has the Pac-12 network around the country, so they're not watching those games. So this is a team that's like for the average fan is going to come as quite a surprise. And just by virtue of the fact that like most coaches like tend to watch less of the West Coast than they watch of the East Coast, I think it's going to be interesting just to see how they approach this moment because they're so new, they're so different. They don't defend all that well. Like I think you could see some kind of like Indiana Iowa type matchups happening between the two of them. But yeah, they're really well, like they execute very well on the offensive end, and I've seen almost no team able to get them out of that comfort zone.
To that point, they're 4th in the country in 2-point percentage, 29th in 3-point percentage, but 4th in the country overall in field goal percentage. So a very, very efficient offense. I want to touch briefly on the Big Ten, and you mentioned them as kind of one of the deepest conferences, maybe the deepest conference in the country this year. The two of the 2 seeds are Big Ten teams in Iowa and Maryland. What are their chances at making a deep run and maybe a Final Four?
I mean, obviously, Iowa has a better chance of making the Final Four because their number 1 seed is not South Carolina. But
yes.
I think if you were in the 2 range, your entire selection Sunday thought process had to just be, please not South Carolina. Please not South Carolina. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that Iowa is coming into the tournament with all of this momentum because of that, end of the season, the way they ended against Indiana, the fact that they won the Big Ten tournament. And then, Caitlin Clark putting that triple-double performance in the final. Like, none of those games were all that close. But they kind of did that last year and then lost in the second game against Creighton, even though they were, hosting last year just like they are this year. I do think that this team is a little bit better. Caitlin Clark is just better. She's a better distributor. She's a better scorer, even if she's not putting up, like, she didn't lead the nation in scoring this year like she did last year, but I do think that she's been more effective. And then, the fact that their starting lineup has been together for the last 3 years and just plays every game together is insane, but like also kind of cool. And one of the reasons that I love college basketball. So you'd like to think that extra year of experience is going to help them out more. The fact that they do have this really just deeply upsetting loss to Creighton last year that they have to avenge. So I would think that, Iowa's really popular favorite to get out of that bracket. I'm interested to see how they're going to match up against Duke, honestly, because Duke and Iowa played last year during the regular season, and Duke beat them, and Duke didn't even make the NCAA tournament last year, but they're still an outstanding defensive team, and were able to just ruin all of the beauty that is Iowa's offense. So it's like, if you were to pick like the most stylistically diametrically opposed matchup in the NCAA tournament, the most possibly opposed one, it's got to be Duke versus Iowa, because the ugliest team in the country, Duke, the way they play basketball, versus Iowa. So I'm interested to see that matchup. But I also think that like Iowa has a tough region ahead, because, we've mentioned Duke, like Texas, if that ends up being an Elite Eight matchup, Texas is an outstanding defensive team too. And you've got a player like Rory Harmon who's had tournament success. She led her team to the Elite Eight last year, only losing to Stanford. And, Stanford, obviously the number 1 seed, a really, really great team that has, the type of defensive pieces who can give Caitlin Clark trouble. And they've been at this stage before. They know how to execute. So as much as I like Iowa, I think that their region is really, really hard. And that's going to, present some challenges on their way to the Final Four. Whereas Maryland, yeah, they have to get past this behemoth that is South Carolina. But their number 3 seed is Notre Dame, which is in a really tough position here without Olivia Miles. And, that 7-10 matchup between West Virginia and Arizona, like kudos to West Virginia for making the tournament. If they face Maryland, they're going to get absolutely waxed. And Arizona is dealing with all of these injury issues, and I'm not even sure they're going to get past West Virginia. So I would almost like pen Maryland into the Elite Eight right now. It's just, that next step to get to Dallas is going to be so challenging. And obviously the Big Ten has this streak of having not made the Final Four. I can't remember how many years it is exactly, but I don't think any team has made the national championship game since 2005, when that was Michigan State. So, it's been a long run, and somebody's got to get there. I do believe this is the year that the streak ends for the Final Four. I just don't think it's going to be Maryland, but I could see it being, Indiana, Iowa, or Ohio State. I think all of those teams have a good chance to get out of their respective regions.
A Maryland South Carolina matchup would be maybe it would certainly be more interesting if Owusu and Reese hadn't transferred from Maryland, and then it would be a very interesting matchup. But yeah, South Carolina it's unbelievable how good they've been this season. We'll end on this because we're running low on time. What are then your Final Four predictions? Is the Big Ten going to break that streak this year then?
Yeah, so my current Final Four projections are South Carolina, Indiana, UConn, and Texas.
That Iowa Duke matchup that you mentioned is going to be fascinating, because
I'm not even sure Duke gets to that matchup, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, fair. I mean, when you make games ugly all the time, it can come back to bite you. But theoretically, if it happens, it's like one of the top offenses versus one of the top defenses, and that's going to be, as you said, 2 diametrically opposed teams to play one another. So I'm fascinated by so many matchups in the tournament this season. I'm looking forward to it all kicking off on Friday. Let the people know where they can find you and your work at.
Yeah, so I cover women's basketball at The Athletic, so please check out theathletic.com for everything that we're going to be writing about the tournament. And if you're more of a social media person, then The Athletic WBB on Twitter. And I'm also on Twitter at SabrinaJM, which is so lovingly put here. So please interact with me.
We appreciate all the coverage you have given the Hoosiers all year. You wrote a great feature on them earlier in the year before that Ohio State game, so you guys can go back and find that as well. But big thanks for coming on and previewing all of this with us. Big thanks to you guys for making us your first listen every single day. We'll be back tomorrow to get you all the final info you need before both the men's and women's games this weekend. Make sure you check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. They have everything you need to know heading into the tournament, starting today, but throughout this weekend. Follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast, all of that great stuff. But most importantly, guys, have a great day, and LEO.